In 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States after running a campaign largely based upon fixing the U.S. trade deficit, an apparent sign that the U.S. and its residents were on the losing end of the new international trade regime. At least one thing he identified is right. The U.S. is definitely in a trade deficit. After the recession of the mid-1970s, the United States largely became a net importer, meaning the nation imported more goods and services than it exported. That's why our net exports value is usually negative. Reasons for this vary. One, the U.S.'s economy has exponentially grown since the 1970s, and we know that higher levels of income often lead to more imports. It's also possible that with a shift towards a services-based economy, it's harder to measure the value of abstract services, like search engines or social media, leading to an undervaluation of the services we export. Other factors can impact net exports too, including price levels, the exchange rate, trade policies, preferences, and even technology. Any or all of these factors could cause net exports to change, shifting the aggregate demand curve by a multiplied amount. So, if, for example, a Federal Reserve action raises interest rates, leading to an increased demand for US dollars from foreigners, at the same time that the supply of dollars decreases, therefore increasing the exchange rate, net exports may decline, for example, by $200 billion, causing the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left by $300 billion. So if we export more than aggregate demand will increase at any price level. That's pretty straightforward, but there's more to know about trade regarding international finance, which tells us what the macroeconomic effects are of financial flows across borders. Money denominated in different nations' currencies flows across borders every second of every day. National leaders are interested in the net effect of those flows, something we call the balance of payments. To analyze this in a simple way, your textbook ignores transfer payments across borders and uses an equilibrium statement that the quantity of currency demanded equals the quantity of currency supplied. This doesn't always happen for any one nation in the real world because trade isn't perfectly multilateral. But let's put that aside for the moment. We can make some familiar statements regarding that equilibrium. First, the quantity of currency demanded comes from two sources. Exports, because foreign buyers need to exchange their currency for US dollars to buy our goods and services, purchases of our domestic assets from the rest of the world for a similar reason. Likewise, the quantity of currency supplied comes from imports and domestic purchases of the rest of the world's assets, because Americans need to exchange US dollars to buy goods denominated in foreign currencies. This implies that all activity that sends currency overseas should be equivalent in value to all activity that attracts currency from overseas, again, in a perfectly multilateral world of trade. Also means that net exports should be equivalent to the rest of the world's purchases of our assets, minus our purchases of their assets with an opposite sign. Let me explain why. Remember back when I told you that net exports is theoretically the same size as the GDP gap in the aggregate expenditures model? And that was because savings equaled planned inventory investment. But if there was an imbalance between what businesses planned for and what domestic consumers demanded, then some demand would flow overseas. That outflow is the import number and results in U.S. consumers sending U.S. dollars to other country producers. In one version of this model, those producers would use those dollars to purchase goods and services back from us, our exports. But there's also the reality that some money is flowing overseas in the form of savings, being used to buy assets from other countries. And that same happens in return. Foreigners use some of their US dollars to buy our assets and invest in our producers to help them meet more of our domestic demand. In that case, in a perfect world, our net exports, goods, and services should be the opposite of our net exports savings. In international finance, a net exports number is roughly the same as the balance on the current account, which, as you could guess, means that the US has a negative current account balance, or current account deficit. The complement to the current account is the capital account, which considers the cross-border flows related to purchases of assets. And since it's the opposite of flows happening with net exports, if the current account is in a deficit, the capital account should be in a surplus. And again, in a perfectly multilateral world. Real takeaway is that because each nation has its own currency, cash flowing out will almost always flow back into a country. So President Trump's critique of our trade deficit was more specifically a critique of our current account deficit. By default, our capital account surplus. But that doesn't answer the main question. Was he right or wrong about deficits being bad? Current account deficits are usually an indication that consumers are purchasing a lot, which probably means they have the disposable income or credit to do so. Capital account surpluses do indicate that some domestic assets are at least in part owned by people overseas, and that income generated from that asset will go overseas. But if everyone at home has enough money to send some of it outside the country, then households in aggregate probably aren't hurting from that cross border flow. Really, the issue is when you disaggregate households. Are they all thriving equally under a trade deficit? Even if households on net are able to send cash overseas to buy goods, services, and even investments, doesn't mean the poorest households and the richest households are both equally able to do so. That problem isn't necessarily fixed by creating a trade surplus. Regardless, the households on the lower end of the spectrum might be left wondering then, there's so much cash flowing around that some of it can even go overseas. Why then isn't more of it coming to me?